Everyone, I would like to welcome you to our presentation tonight. This evening, I would like to introduce our guest speaker. She's been affiliated with the Autism Society for about 20 years now. She does have a son who's on the spectrum. He's 35 years old, so she has experience preparing her child for college personally. She's also an author of a few books related to autism that can be found on Autism Society's website. If you are interested in those books, she's going to have the titles of those books at the end of her presentation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker on preparing for college, Ms. Ann Palmer.
Thank you, Shanye, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening and for your interest in this topic. So today I'll be talking about preparing the student with autism for college and adulthood, focusing on the supports that are available for students at the college level and the importance of self-advocacy skills and functional skills for college and for adult life. No matter the age of your child or student with autism, it's not too early to start thinking about this and preparing for this important transition. Okay, so if you have a younger child with autism and you're listening tonight, you may be having trouble imagining that your child will ever be able to go to college. And some of the skills I'll be talking about today that are needed in college may seem impossible right now, but keep in mind that our kids are constantly learning. Adolescence and the young adult years are often times of great progress and learning for our kids, and you may not even realize that college is possible until your student's in high school. So keep the door open for considering college as an option for your child. And a student with autism's path to college may look a little different than what you or I may have experienced ourselves. Some students might need to stay in high school longer, or they may need to delay going to college immediately following high school. And some students may need to have more supports to be able to attend college. It's really going to depend on that student. But the good news is that there are different options for a college experience, and more students are finding it possible to go to college and graduate from college. The actual academic planning for college is going to start early, usually in middle school, when you plan what courses the student's going to take in high school and whether or not that student will be on a college track. But we can start preparing our students in other ways much earlier, in ways to prepare them for those skills that they'll need in college and in adulthood. So how do we know if the student's ready for college? I get asked that a lot, and there really isn't an easy answer to the question. Sometimes we don't know if they're truly ready until they're actually there. But here are some questions we can ask ourselves to help decide if the student's ready or what skills we need to be working on to help them get ready for college. First of all, do they have the academic skills to be able to do the academic work that's required? And I think, there are lots of accommodations and supports available for academic help, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Do they have the organizational skills needed to get to classes on time, to get their work completed and turned in to the professors? Can they independently set an alarm, get to class, get meals, and deal with the downtime between classes? And can the student be safe on a college campus? Can they make safe choices? Is the student able to advocate for themselves? Mom and dad won't be with them on the college campus, so they'll have to ask for help when they need it. And I'll be talking quite a bit about advocacy in a few minutes. So I've learned in that little boy cute, that's my son Eric, and I've learned through my own experience that you really can't predict when our kids are young what they're going to be able to accomplish as an adult. When my son Eric was diagnosed with autism about the time of this picture, when he was almost 3, I assumed college would never be possible. This was 33 years ago. As Shanye said, he's 35 now. And at that time, I had no idea that college was even possible for people with autism. Eric struggled socially. He was very echolalic. He had frequent meltdowns when things changed or didn't go as he wanted. And, how I kept thinking, how could he possibly ever go to college with those challenges that we were dealing with? But now, fast forward 20 years, and this is a picture of Eric that was taken on Mother's Day in 2006 when Eric graduated from North Carolina State University. I obviously couldn't predict when Eric was younger what he would learn and what he'd be able to do as an adult. And I really didn't think college was possible for him until he was in high school. And when we left him at college for the first time, I had no idea if he would survive or if I would survive, but we did. And I'm glad we did, so I can tell you about our experience and hopefully help some of your children and students going through this process. I think preparing the student and preparing yourself as the parent is key. The first step towards planning for your child's future is going to be the transition plan. Under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the transition plan needs to be in place by age 14 in North Carolina. If you don't know if your child has a transition plan and they're 14 or older, you need to ask about it. Parents will often tell me that they don't know if they have a transition plan for their child because the transition plan was discussed during the annual IEP meeting, and the parents didn't even know it was discussed. It was kind of folded in, and they didn't realize the transition plan was even a part of it. Personally, I think that transition out of high school to whatever comes next is really too important to not give it a lot of time and adequate time. We had separate transition plan meetings for Eric throughout high school, and you may want to request that, or at least have time allocated during the IEP meeting to discuss transition. For the first time during the transition plan meeting, the student has to officially be invited to attend. And in any meeting where transition is discussed, they have to be invited to be there. And I strongly recommend that the student attend, that they participate at whatever level they can. This should be their meeting. They need to be there to share their dreams, their ideas, their concerns about their future. And the wording under IDEA describes transition as the movement from school to post-school activities. These post-school activities include not only college or vocational education, it also includes supported employment, independent living, leisure activities, and adult services. So these meetings are not just about transition to college, but they're about transition to adult life. So they're really important. As a parent, I think to start preparing for this important transition, it's good to be thinking about your vision for your child, your dreams, your hopes for them, what you think is possible, but don't assume that your vision is the same as the vision that your child might have for themselves. What makes them happy? What are their dreams for themselves? It's really important to focus on what they envision for themselves as adults. And I also always suggest to parents to reach out to other parents you may know who have been through this transition before. Reach out to the professionals that you know and trust, those who know your child and can advise you during this time. And during those years before the transition, focus on goals for the IEP or the transition plan that are practical. They should be age appropriate and useful. They should be goals that will help develop skills that they're going to need as adults, not just as high school students. So academic skills will be important for succeeding in college, but it's really going to be the functional skills that are going to be more important for college and for adult life. So by functional skills, I mean those skills that the student's going to need to be as independent as possible. Whether they go to college or whether they go to work following high school, they're going to need to have functional skills. So here are some areas that need to be addressed and some questions that we can ask ourselves as we prepare for the transition to adulthood. Will the student be able to live in the community? If so, what level of support might they need? What will that look like? Can they independently brush their teeth, take showers, do laundry, and do other self-care activities? And if not, what skills do you need to be working on so they can do those things as independently as possible? Communication is going to be a very important functional skill in adulthood for all of our kids, wherever they may fall on the autism spectrum. Can the student initiate asking for help? Can they report to someone when they're sick or they're hurt? And for those students who have higher level communication skills, can they answer the telephone? Can they make phone calls? Can they make doctor's appointments or use email? These are all going to be communication skills they'll need at the college level. So also think about the students' financial skills. Can they use money in a functional way? Can they follow a budget? I've personally decided that no college students can follow a budget, but that's on another topic. So if they're going to need help with their finances, what's that going to look like? Who will help them? Also, think about their transportation needs. Will they be driving? If not, do they know how to access and use public transportation? This is one of our biggest challenges now with our son, because he doesn't drive and he doesn't live in a city with great mass transit. So getting to and from school or to and from work is going to be crucial. So you need to be thinking about their transportation skills. We also need to be thinking about the vocational skills the student's going to need when they're working, because hopefully they won't be in school forever. So what work skills would they need to have to do their dream job? And then don't forget about what we call the soft skills in the workplace, their interpersonal skills, getting along with coworkers, taking instruction from a supervisor, handling break time at work. So how much assistance might they need in the workplace? So these are a lot of different topics and a lot of important questions, but it gives you kind of a starting point to be thinking about these things when you're planning the transition and talking about these areas during that transition plan meeting. And a lot of these things that I've just talked about can be worked on when our kids are much younger, well before they're actually having a transition plan in high school. So in preparing for the transition, it's also important for the student and the parents to understand that high school and college are going to be very different experiences. My son didn't really understand what going to college would look like, and I needed to explain some of the differences between going to high school and going to college in order to help him decide if college was something he even wanted to do. There are many different ways, they're different, but here are a few differences I think are important to point out. The student at the college level is going to be in class maybe 15 hours a week instead of the typical 30 hours a week in high school. Most of their academic work in college is actually going to be done outside of class time. The college student sets their own schedule, chooses their own classes to attend, what time those classes meet, how long they have breaks between classes. They can even take evening classes if they want. So this is very different from the strict schedule of high school. And it's helpful for the student to understand ahead of time that this is going to look very different. Also, in college, the professors aren't typically giving a lot of reminders about when assignments are due. They're not checking on the individual student's understanding of the material like teachers do in high school. The student will have to independently get their work done and get it in on time. They'll have to ask for help if they don't understand. And probably, I think one of the most important distinctions to be aware of is that in public high school, the student with a disability has to be served. You know, even if they're struggling academically or behaviorally, the school still has to serve those students. But in college, all students with or without disabilities have to meet the academic requirements to get in and to stay in. And challenging behaviors in college are not going to be tolerated. So these are good differences to know and to help prepare the student for the changes that are going to be happening for them. And as you prepare for the transition out of high school, think about all the different options that are possible for a college experience. There are more options for a student with autism than ever before, including options for students with autism who also have an intellectual disability. It's important to look at all the options before dismissing college as a possibility for your student. So there are different kinds of schools. Community colleges and technical schools can be wonderful options for students with ASD. They're usually less competitive to get in. They have smaller classes, smaller campuses to navigate, and they're less expensive than the larger universities. And oftentimes they'll offer a vocational training component, which is great, getting a career development while they're in college. You also have choices to think about, such as going to college part-time as opposed to full-time. Many of our students with autism do well starting part-time, maybe taking one course and then adding more courses if things are going well. There's also the online option of getting a college degree where you don't even have to go to physical classes at all. And this can be an option that's good for students that have a lot of social anxieties. Students also don't have to live on campus in a dormitory, but they can live at home and commute to school. Living in a dormitory can add a lot of stress to the college experience for the student with autism. And there are also college options that specifically serve students with learning differences who might need a higher level of support in college. And I want to tell you a little bit more about those. So there are college support programs across the country that are designed specifically to provide intensive supports to students with developmental disabilities or autism. In North Carolina, we're very fortunate. There are 24 programs on college campuses that support students with autism who also have intellectual disabilities. They're located in community colleges around the state and some of the larger universities as well, such as Appalachian State, UNC Greensboro, Western Carolina. They offer the academic and life skills supports. And in most of these cases, most of these programs, they also provide vocational training and support for the transition to independent living after college. So they're really wonderful programs. And it's important, though, to point out again that these programs that I'm describing in North Carolina typically only serve students who have intellectual disabilities as well as autism. So keep that in mind. The first website that you see that I've got listed here is for the Post-Secondary Education Alliance website. And they have a chart that describes all 24 programs of North Carolina. And the second link is for the Think College website, where you can search for programs like that across the country, not just in North Carolina. There are also intensive support programs for students with learning differences that are run through private companies, such as the two examples I give here on your slide, the College Living Experience and the College Internship Program. Both of these programs offer support for students with learning disabilities. These are programs that are designed to offer intensive supports to students with learning differences that are run through private companies. And these are two examples, College Living Experience and College Internship Program. And they will supply supports in terms of academic, social skills, residential living, organizational skills. The students typically live off campus in supported apartment living situations, and they attend classes at a college campus nearby. So they transport them to the college for the classes. They're in multiple locations around the country, but none are in North Carolina, unfortunately. So they're also typically very expensive. So I think you need to consider that as well, but it may be an option to consider. Hopefully they would have some scholarships or financial aid that might be available. So there are also intensive support programs that are run by colleges that are housed on college campuses. And Marshall University, that I have listed here in West Virginia, is just one example. And this is an excellent program It's called the College Program for Students with ASD, and they provide academic, social, and independent living support for a small number of Marshall College students who have autism. And you might want to make a note of the link that I have here on the bottom is a new link. I added it, I think, since David sent out the handout. So you might want to make a note of that particular link. It's to a database where you can search for other college-based programs like Marshall that serve students with autism across the country. And on this particular site, you can click on a certain state and get a list of programs that exist in that particular state. And so the last option that I'll be describing in more depth is the college experience option that I call the full inclusion college experience. And this is what my son Eric did. This is where the student enrolls in the college just like any other student. They have to follow the same guidelines that all students follow, and they can receive accommodations and support if they disclose about their disability or diagnosis. In this option, parents have very limited involvement on campus, and the student really has to self-advocate if they need support. So David, this was the point where I thought it might be helpful if people had questions that I could try to answer some of those for them about the material I've covered.
The question that we've had so far is, can a person have an IDA transition plan if they are homeschooled?
There is no IEP if the student is homeschooled, because an IEP is something that's provided in public school. So I am not sure about. I believe, though, it's my understanding that in the high school years, it's possible for homeschoolers to have a connection with their homeschool for the transition plan. IEPs, I don't think are something you'd have access to as a homeschooler, but I think there is a possibility that a transition plan is something that can be accessed through your home school. But you know, I am not sure for that, but I've never heard of a homeschooler having an IEP.
The next question came in is, can a kid with autism go to a college, for example, like the University of Colorado at Boulder, where there are limited services and possibly be successful? And they're asking you just for your opinion on that.
Well, I don't know about that particular school, and I don't know quite what the participant asking the question means by limited supports. I think all colleges, as I'm getting ready to talk about the federal laws that protect students with disabilities, and all colleges have to offer accommodations to make the information accessible for the student. So the accommodations that I'm getting ready to talk about should be offered by that college, and any college, a community college or a smaller four-year university. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I'm guessing there are going to be accommodations there that can be very helpful for a student with autism. So I think it is possible, and I'll be covering more of that in a minute.
Okay, and just a couple people have commented related to the part about transition plans. Apparently with some new North Carolina financial assistance options for homeschool students, there's the option for getting some IEPs, and they are actually required as part of the financial assistance options. It's something that's new. So at the end, we'll try to reiterate how to follow up and maybe connect with one of our autism resource specialists where you could get more information about that. Here's one last question on this section, and then we'll move on. In a program like at UNCG, since there's no degree track, is there financial aid? And what typically happens after the kids transition out of these programs?
There is always financial aid available at programs like the one at UNCG, Beyond Academics. I believe there's financial aid available, and I know that particular program at UNCG does do transition support when they're done with college. So it doesn't just end their last day of school. They actually do some work the last year of school in preparing them for work and for independent living. So yes, and so a lot of these programs are going to have a component that helps with that transition out of college as well. But moving on, so if your student is enrolled, say your student has applied and they've been accepted at college, they're officially going. The first thing you need to be aware of is that there's no longer IDEA or IEPs at the college level. I hear a lot of parents who are surprised that there aren't IEPs in college, but there are not. As I mentioned before, there's no longer a requirement that the college serve the student if they're struggling. And there is no IDEA there, but there are federal laws that protect students with disabilities in college, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I'm going to describe in a little more detail for you. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act applies to federally funded programs, which many colleges receive federal funds, and it ensures that individuals with disabilities have the same access as students without disabilities. And under 504, it also forbids any kind of discrimination based on disability in any federally funded program. ADA broadens that protection beyond just federally funded programs, and it applies to all colleges and to the workplace as well. So it's going to be ADA that is supporting our individuals or adults with autism in the workplace as well. And ADA is all about access, physical access, which that would be the wheelchair ramps, the braille in the elevators, things, accommodations like that. But it also is about access to information and programs. So receiving accommodations under ADA is going to be based on documentation. Has to be reports and that are turned in that document that students' learning skills, lack of challenges in learning, and these documentations have to be current. Typically, it's within 3 years. So I put a note in here, need testing in high school, meaning I always recommend to parents not to waive any of the testing that happens in public high school, because that testing can be really helpful for the college. That documentation will go towards the college requirements of documentation. So this documentation that I'm talking about needs to identify that the student has a diagnosis. It also has to show how that diagnosis or that disability affects their current learning. Okay, and so a psychological evaluation that was done when your child was 7 is probably not going to be helpful to them. They're going to be looking for information about the student's current learning. Okay, so the colleges decide what information they need in that documentation. They decide who the reports need to come from, who signs off on them, and how recent they need to be. So you really need to check the college website that you're interested in, or call the Disability Services Office at any college that you're considering to find out what kind of documentation that they're going to need. The important thing to know about the student's rights under both of these federal laws, I think, is that if the student qualifies for admission in that college, they have a right to be there. And if they have a right to be there, they have a right to access all academic and non-academic programs that are available for any student at that college. So these laws also provide the student the right to confidentiality of all of their disability-related information, which means that that information that they've given, that documentation, any information from meetings with someone on campus there to talk about accommodations, that information cannot be shared with anyone unless the student requests that, including parents, which is an important point to make. That information from college will not be shared with the parents unless the student who has the disability ask for a waiver, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the student with a disability, if they're qualified based on documentation, is eligible to receive reasonable accommodations related to their disability. And I'm accenting the word reasonable here. The best way I think to think about this is that the students are eligible to receive help that gives them the same or equal access to information that all other students without disabilities receive. So it's like a leveling the playing field. There can be no unfair advantage, but equal access is what's important about that. Okay, so an accommodation might be considered unreasonable if it causes a major change in the curriculum, or if it causes a major change in how that curriculum is going to be provided by the professor. The accommodation can also be judged unreasonable if it causes an undue financial burden or an undue administrative burden to provide that accommodation. So here are some examples of what would be considered unreasonable accommodations, and accommodations that are typically not allowed at the college level. Reduced assignments, which many of our students have in school in their younger years, I think, is pretty common. Exceptions to behavior codes, having a personal aide in the classroom or in the dorm, or retaking of any exams. These accommodations our students have had oftentimes in public school, but they are not considered reasonable accommodations at the college level. But there are many that are, and here's a list of some of the reasonable accommodations. All of these here on your slide are ones that my son received at some point during his college years, and all were very helpful and not difficult for him to receive. Extended time for testing and separate setting for testing are very popular accommodations that many students with learning disabilities or ADHD receive these accommodations in college. Priority seating is also very helpful for students who might need to sit up front near the professor to focus better, or maybe they might want to sit in the back of the classroom to be able to exit quickly if needed. Priority registration is a great accommodation, and this one allows a student with a disability to access the registration for classes before other students get a chance to get online to register. So you tend to get a better opportunity to get better classes because you get to get into the mix before the other students do. Hard copies of notes, tape recording lectures are good accommodations for students who struggle with taking notes, which my son did. And some colleges offer the opportunity for students to have a single dorm room if they're living on campus. This would be a room without a roommate. If they have a disability, they may be able to qualify for that as well. You have to pay extra for that, but we found that that was a very helpful accommodation for my son Eric to have a separate room. So in order to receive any of these accommodations, the student has to request them through the Disability Services office on campus. This office is going to be the most important, probably, support for the student who's fully included in college. Every college or university will have an office on disabilities. It might be called a different name, but they all have to have them. Under ADA and 504, they have to have an office available for students to receive some support. So here is where the student has to formally disclose about their diagnosis with the documentation I talked about earlier in order to get any accommodations. I always recommend that the family make the connection with the disabilities office at every college that you're thinking about. When you go visit the school, go to the Disabilities Services office and talk to one of the staff people there. Ask questions about their services, about what supports they offer. In my college book that I wrote, I have a list of questions to consider asking to find out more about the services that they offer for students with autism. So once the student is enrolled in the college, it's really helpful for them to meet on a regular basis with the people at disability services so they can get to know the student, but also so the student can become comfortable with that office and with the staff there. Because this is where they're going to need to go if they're struggling or if they need help. As helpful as this office can be, however, whether the student benefits from that support that they offer is going to depend on whether they're willing to self-advocate. Now, my son would meet regularly with his support person at the Disability Services Office at NC State, but if he didn't report any problems, or if that person didn't happen to ask the right questions, she wouldn't necessarily know if he was having problems. So self-advocacy is going to be necessary in order to actually receive accommodations. They have to know the student's having a problem to be able to offer some support. And also advocacy has to happen for the professors to actually give the accommodation. So here's the example. This is how it worked at NC State. My son would meet with the disability services person at the end of each semester. It was just him and this person. I was never at any of those meetings. They would decide what accommodations he would need for his classes for that next semester. And then the office would email a letter that they drafted together, and it would go to each of the professors at the beginning of the next semester. It introduced Eric, it described what accommodations he qualifies for, but then it would say in the letter, the student will need to communicate with you to initiate receiving these accommodations. So there is that self-advocacy piece again, and that's an example of why it's so important. I thought this might be a good spot for people who had questions in particular about the disability services and accommodations. I covered a lot of material there kind of quickly.
Would you please talk about the resources that are available to help students learn how to self-advocate? Are high schools responsible for teaching these skills? Is that something that autism resource specialists from the Autism Society of North Carolina can teach a workshop on? Or are there other sources of information that you would recommend that can help parents and caregivers help their child become better self-advocates?
Okay, that's a great question. I think it's a combination of the family. I mean, you're teaching, and I'm getting ready to cover strategies for self-advocacy that we can do through our family, our home situation. So there's definitely that piece that you will be possibly the one teaching your child to self-advocate in some ways, but there's also some ideas of things you could have in the IEP or things that can be done through the school to help them learn to be a better self-advocate. I know that the autism resource specialists in their workshops touch on self-advocacy in a number of their workshops. I think they do on the transition workshop that they do. So they would be a good resource for you to contact them with other ideas of ways to work on that. But if the student is in public school and they're in regular education classes all day, chances are they're not working on some of these kind of skills. So a lot of those, I think, are going to have to be worked on through the family, through a therapist outside of school. But I'll answer more of that question for you in the slides coming.
One quick question was, how long did it take for your son to finish college, and did he attend as a full-time student?
It took him 5 years to graduate, and he attended as a full-time student, but minimal full-time. And that was in order for him to stay on our health insurance. He needed to be a full-time college student to be able to stay on our health insurance at that time. So I think the minimum number of hours that he could take and be considered full-time was 12 hours a semester. And that's probably why it took him 5 years to finish. Plus, he flunked a couple classes and had to retake some classes, so it took him a little bit longer. But I really felt that having a smaller caseload, course load, was helpful for his stress level. So he would only take, maybe 4 classes a semester, which I think is something to consider for students with any kind of learning difference.
There was one question that kind of goes back to where we were before. Do college disability services typically require a psych evaluation from the school system, or is a private one obtained during that is obtained during the teen years acceptable?
They do typically want the psychological evaluation, and my understanding is they'll take that from the school, from a public school or privately. And I know people who homeschool will often pay for someone to do that psych evaluation privately. So my understanding is colleges will take from either public school or through a private psychologist or psychiatrist or whoever's doing the evaluation. Okay, so let's talk more about the whole issue of self-advocacy. I think, so we know that advocacy by that student is going to be very important in the college setting. The student is 18 or over at this point. They're considered an adult. They're treated as an adult. And the parents are not going to be a part of their day-to-day experience on campus. So it's important that the student have some understanding of their diagnosis, their strengths, their needs, because they will have to be the one to ask for help if they need it and explain why they need that help. The parents, as I mentioned earlier, can only be involved in meetings or get any information from the school, even the grades. If you don't get grades, which always blew my mind that I was paying all that money for college and didn't get his grades, but you don't get any information unless the student asks for and signs what's called a FERPA waiver, Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And it doesn't work for the parent to call them and say, to call disability services and say, my son needs to sign the FERPA waiver so I can be included on that meeting or get this information. That doesn't fly. The student has to be the one asking for the FERPA waiver. They have to say to that disability services staff person, I want to sign the FERPA waiver so that my parents can be involved in this conversation we're having. Okay, so there is a way that parents can be more involved, but it has to be up to the student. So there are things that, like the person had just asked about, that we can be doing when the student's younger to help build their self-advocacy skills. As I already mentioned, we need to raise their awareness and understanding about their diagnosis, what they do well, what's challenging for them. So when something is difficult for them, we need to help them understand why and point out the strengths when they're doing something well, when things are easy for them. You know, talk about it when they're young about how well they do this, how fast they get those math problems done, or how cool that they know all the capitals of the states in the country. Whatever it is that they're doing well, their strengths, we need to point those out to our kids when they're younger, so they have an understanding of all the good things that they do. But the same applies to the challenges that they may face. We need to be talking about those and helping them understand those better as well. I often see students with autism who are in college and who refuse to disclose about their autism, maybe because they don't want to receive any help, or they think they can do it without help, or they don't want to appear different or needy in any way. And what I find is that a lot of times these students end up flunking out or dropping out when there were supports that could have helped them if they had just been willing to disclose about their diagnosis. So one thing I've thought about that we can do ahead of time when our kids are younger to make sure this doesn't happen is we can help them understand that everyone learns differently. Everyone needs help sometimes, and it's okay. It's okay to ask for help or receive help when needed. And I think if we talk to our kids when they're young and they grow up knowing that everybody needs help sometimes and it's okay, maybe they'd be less, have less problems with disclosing as an adult. We also can get them used to self-advocating by showing them that their opinion matters, by respecting their point of view, by including them in everyday decisions and choices when they're younger. it was a lot easier for me to make decisions for Eric than to wait for him to make a decision sometimes. But I think it's important that we let them be more involved in the decision making whenever we can. Also, it's okay, they need to know it's okay to ask for help. And in order to do this, to let them make decisions, we have to also let them make mistakes sometimes, and that's hard. We also need to not wait until the student's in his later years of high school to start talking about the future, to start talking about their goals and their dreams. We start these discussions early when they're younger, and we start preparing and planning early. I think that's also really important. Here are some strategies that we can also put in place to try to help learn these self-advocacy skills that are going to be so important. And one is that I have a real regret that I did not involve my son in every IEP meeting we ever had at school. I didn't start including him until he was in high school, and I think that was a mistake. The student needs to be aware of the supports that they receive in school to help them be successful. They need to be aware that there's a team of people behind the scenes that want them to succeed, and what kinds of supports help them in a classroom. And I think this can help make them later on, if they go to these IEP meetings when they're younger, it will help them be more accepting of receiving help as an adult, can help them understand more about their learning challenges and what helps them, and give them actual experience in speaking up for themselves and sharing their perspective during those IEP or school meetings. So I really recommend that we keep our kids involved in those kind of meetings as best we can that, you know, makes sense for that particular student. We can also help their advocacy skills by giving them opportunities to build on communication skills, those important communication skills I talked about earlier. Maybe they can have a job on campus in high school where they work in the library one period a week, or in the guidance office, or wherever they have to communicate with other people to get them more comfortable with doing that. If possible, we can include our children in helping to make their doctor's appointments, their therapy appointments, and doing that themselves. That helps with building self-advocacy skills. And then we can include goals in their IEPs where maybe they have to report information to people in authority. So say they have to take some kind of information to the principal's office every day, something that gets them out there initiating communication with people to get them more comfortable with doing that. And lastly, when they're younger and problems happen, which they do, we need to use those experiences as problem-solving learning experiences. So what I mean by that is when things are calm, when a problem's happened and then everybody's calm afterwards, we need to talk about it. We need to talk about, well, why did this happen? What can we do next time to keep this from happening again? Or what would have been a better response that they could have had when this happens in the future? So I think, you know, discussing those problems will really help in their understanding about how to solve problems when they're independent from you on a college campus somewhere. So closely related, I think, to the whole issue of self-advocacy is self-disclosure. And this, you know, who does the student tell about their diagnosis? When do they disclose? How do they tell other people? And disclosing is a very personal decision, and it's the student's decision. When they're an adult, you know, when they're very young, as parents, we make that decision for them about who knows and who doesn't. But as they get older, they should be making that decision themselves. And at the college level, it's totally up to them about whether or not other people know about their diagnosis. Disclosing is going to depend upon their acceptance of their diagnosis, their desire to share that information, but it's also going to depend upon whether that other person really needs to know, or if it's going to help them to know about the student's diagnosis. Maybe sometimes it's not necessary. Now, when Eric was in college, he disclosed about his autism in his application to college, in the essay that he had to submit with his application. Not all students will need to do that or necessarily want to do that. It's going to depend, I think, on the weight of their application, whether there needs to be an explanation about any deficits in the application. Eric didn't have a very strong application, was missing some things, and it was helpful for him to disclose about his autism in explaining some of those deficits. But I highly recommend that the student disclose to disability services as soon as possible once they have enrolled in a college, even if they don't need accommodations at that point. The information, any information they give that office will be kept confidential, but then if problems happen, they'll already be connected. And it's going to be much harder for the student to disclose about their diagnosis when they're having problems, when their stress level is really high. So I think it makes a lot of sense to disclose through that office when the student enters, if not before, and make sure that you're in the system so that if problems do come up, if accommodations are needed, the student will be able to access those. As you know, disclosure has to happen with that documentation at Disability Services, as I mentioned earlier, to receive any accommodations, but disclosing to other people in the college setting can be really challenging for students with autism who may feel uncomfortable initiating around something so personal as that. So it can be done verbally if a student has that capability, or in writing. Eric was not comfortable striking up a conversation with people about his autism. He started disclosing to his professors his second year in college. He did not disclose his first year. And as I mentioned earlier, he flunked a couple of classes during that year. And so we talked about it and decided it might help if the professors knew about his learning differences. And so with the help of a therapist, he wrote a one-page Eric's learning guide that said in it that he has autism, but it focused on how he learns best in a classroom, what supports he might need there. And this is something I think that can be done when our kids are much younger. Maybe when they're transitioning to a new teacher or to a new school, just sort of a one-page document that describes how this student learns best, what they like about school, what's hard for them, whatever the student wants to include. And I think it's important to keep in mind that disclosure isn't an all or nothing decision. You don't have to give the DSM-5 definition of autism spectrum disorder when you tell people. And you don't have to tell everyone you meet. You tell the people that need to know, and you give them just the information that will help them understand you better. So who might need to know, I think, is a question that I get asked quite a bit. And this is a list of people on campus and offices on a college campus that I think might need to know about a student's diagnosis. And I'm not going to go over each of these for the benefit of time, but these are people I think would benefit from having a better understanding of that student in order to support them. But again, the decision to disclose to these people in different offices on campus will be the student's decision. And that's why I emphasized earlier how important it is to start early talking to them about receiving help, and it's okay to disclose to people. So I now want to talk a little bit about strategies that can be helpful to support the student with autism when they're in college. Every student is different, and we know that, and what works for one student may not for another, but these are just some ideas to consider, some of the strategies that we used with our son, and some I know that have been used by other people that have been told to me were helpful. So when Eric went to college, it was 2001, and this was before the smartphones and iPads that all the students had, and I developed an actual physical notebook for Eric that he kept in his dorm room, and it housed all the go-to information that he might need. there on campus when I wasn't there. So nowadays, of course, this would probably be a computer file. But I included in his physical notebook all the contact information for his family members and the important people and offices on campus that I thought he might need to contact, his RA or resident advisor, disability services, of course, student health. I also included a map of the campus and a bus schedule. I included other sections in the notebook. There was a section about his finances and his campus account. There was a section on social clubs that might be of interest to him on campus, dorm rules section. So something like this needs to really be individualized for that particular student. So what was in Eric's notebook or file would look different maybe than what another student had, but you want it to contain the information that's most important for them to have easy access to, so they can know exactly where to go to get the answer to that question or to know who to contact. So also a support strategy that's always good is anything visual. Because so many of our kids are visual learners, it's going to be helpful for them to use calendars, to-do lists, reminder lists, schedules. All of those things were very helpful to my son in college. And, you know, I think some people are concerned that you don't want your child relying on visuals, but we all use calendars. We all use schedules and lists and reminders, and it's very typical for any adult to use visuals. So it really is something that's especially helpful for students with autism. The syllabus that's given to students for every class in college is a wonderful thing, and I wish that, you know, high school, middle school classes would give the student a syllabus as well, because it's a great visual that helps students know what's going to happen during that semester in that class. Also, many of our students like routines. They do well with rules to go by, and developing good routines early on can be really important, I think, for our students with autism starting college. And I think one thing I want to add to that is not to forget to include times for eating and leisure activities in the routines that they develop. Some of our students may need reminders to include meals when they're busy in college dealing with classes and everything. I've known a couple different students that had trouble finding time to relax and to eat meals while they were in school. So don't forget that part of the schedules and routines as well. Also, any kind of organizers will be helpful, physical organizers for papers and notes and exams, a shower caddy that take the bathroom supplies to the bathroom, and anything that's going to help organize them. Our students often need help with disorganization, and college is not going to be an exception to that at all. And all of the technology that's available now is a great benefit for students who have organizational issues or executive functioning issues like our students. And there are different apps to help with studying, keeping track of assignments and grades. I'm not an expert on this. Eric didn't use any of the apps in college, but I know there are quite a few. I think you should Google those and find out what's possible electronically to help the student stay better organized. And because I couldn't prepare Eric for every possible problem that might happen in college, what I did was I designated point people that he would go to if he had a particular kind of problem. For example, if he had a problem in his dorm room, he would go to his resident advisor, his RA. If he had a problem in a class, he knew to go to that professor of the class or to the person at Disability Services. If he was sick or if he was anxious about something, he knew to go to me or my husband. Designating certain people gave him a first step when he was struggling of who to go to. And it also really helped me sleep at night when I knew that he had sort of a plan for problems if they would happen. It also, I think, helps to prepare scripts that the student can use when they have to have a stressful or difficult conversation with a professor or somebody. For example, you would make maybe a practice script about how to talk to a professor about a problem they're having in the class. You do some role playing, you kind of practice it at home when you're with them beforehand, so they might feel a little more comfortable when they actually have to have that conversation. Some other ideas of support strategies. I mentioned earlier that it helps to have regular scheduled appointments with disability services, but it also helps to do this with the professors as well. A regular check-in with the professor can help lower the anxiety for the student about how they're doing in class. Sometimes a student may need someone to talk to that's not mom or dad, a mentor, or someone closer to their age. Maybe it's another student, a friend, a sibling, a neighborhood friend, therapist, or someone who they trust. And I think it's a little bit complicated sometimes to find a mentor, but I think it's a good idea for students to have someone that they can be open to about talking about things they're dealing with at college that maybe they're not comfortable talking about with mom or dad. And also, all students at the college level are going to get stressed. They're going to need times and places to go to relax and de-stress. So I think it's important to make sure the student has a designated place they feel comfortable going when they're feeling anxious. Maybe it's the library, maybe it's a park or coffee house or wherever. They also may need to have a designated relaxation strategy to follow when they're stressed, something they can practice ahead of time when they're not stressed, and then feel comfortable doing it when they are. So maybe it's deep breathing, or maybe it's yoga, meditation, or it could be just an activity that calms them, reading a book, listening to music, whatever it might be that makes them calm down and makes them feel comfortable. I think it's really important. Anxiety seems to be one of the leading causes of problems for students with autism in college, is the anxiety they might be feeling. So making sure there is a relaxation strategy or a place to go where they can relax when things are challenging. And then also it's true that I mentioned earlier that parents are typically less involved with their children when they're in college, but we can still stay involved by checking in regularly, visiting them on campus if they're living on campus, knowing the schedule for exams, knowing the deadlines for signing up for classes, just knowing the day-to-day things going on campus so that you can remind the student or ask the student, have you done this yet? And just frequent phone calls, checking in. I know when Eric first went to college, I told him it was a rule that he was going to have to talk to me regularly when he first got there, because I was going to be worried about him, and he just was going to have to deal with that. It was a rule. If you'll stay in college if you take mom's phone calls the first week or two, but it didn't last forever. But it was important to me that I touch base with him on a regular basis, and that I got a chance to ask the right questions. If I would ask Eric, how are you doing at school? He would always answer, fine. Doesn't matter if he was not doing fine or doing fine, he would always say fine. So asking more specific questions was much more helpful. Things like, how are your grades doing in your biology class? Do you like your sweet mates? Are you getting enough food to eat? All of those kind of questions, more specific questions where you're actually asking for information, will hopefully get you a lot more information from your student when they're more likely to just say okay in response to every question you ask. So ask more detailed questions and the right questions. So we're wrapping up. We're getting close to the end. In conclusion, some of the more important points that I want to remind folks is the hardest part of college for students with autism is often not going to be the academics, but it's going to be the social issues, the organizational problems, self-care, anxiety issues. So putting in place strategies to work on those issues when they're younger and giving them skills to deal with those kind of problems is going to be helpful. It's also important to remember, as I've talked about frequently tonight, is to work on developing good self-advocacy skills now when they're younger, and do whatever you can to involve the student when they're younger in advocating for themselves. Another thing I have to mention to the parents that are listening today is letting go is hard. Letting go of any child when they're an adult is always difficult for parents, but it's especially difficult with our children who have required so much of our support over the years. I think we go into this expecting this to be difficult, which it is. And I think it's important that parents reach out to your support system during this transition, because you're going to need your friends and advice from people you trust. So it's definitely not a time to do it alone, and you need to reach out to others. Your role as a parent is going to change when your child becomes an adult, whether they go to college or work or a residential program. You will be going from being the main advocate for your child to an advisor to your child. And this is a huge adjustment, and it's difficult, and you'll need support during that transition. And lastly, remember that our kids with autism are always learning. They will surprise you. This picture here is my favorite picture of my 3 children. This was taken many years ago. My youngest son is as tall as Eric is now. Eric, who never likes to have his picture taken, is smiling in this picture, if you can see that. Also, he put his arms around his brother and sister without me telling him to do it, and which is amazing since he doesn't like to be touched or touch other people. But I caught this moment, and I'm really glad that I did, because it reminds me that no matter how much I think I know about autism or how well I think I know Eric, he's going to surprise me. It's not always good surprises like this, but oftentimes it is. And I wish a lot of good surprises for all of you that are listening today with your sons and daughters and your students. These are 3 of the books that I've written. This book here, Realizing the College Dream, is the book I wrote on this particular topic. And all of these books are available through the wonderful Autism Society of North Carolina bookstore. So thank you for listening. And David, I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have received.
Yeah, thank you, Ann. I think everybody appreciates all this information. And one of the questions was, do kids with autism who are in college how would you describe their social life? Do they go to parties and have fun? Any comment or feedback that you could share, perspective on that topic?
Yes, it will definitely depend on the student, of course. My son happens to not be incredibly social. He is alone a lot of the time and doesn't mind being alone, and has never been one of those one of our kids who, feels bad if he doesn't have friends. So he was not extremely sociable in college, but he did go to some parties. But then I know students in college with autism who were very social, and that was a big part of the college experience for them. Making friends and being, maybe finding a girlfriend or a boyfriend can be an important interest for college students, whether they have autism or not. But I find that what I have heard from other students and parents is that this is one of the areas that tends to be extremely difficult for most students with autism, understanding friendships and whether someone is a real friend or not, trying not to be taken advantage of by other people, finding a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Those kind of issues are very challenging in the college setting. But, it just will depend on the student, whether they really try to do that more than other students. Depends on how anxious they get around the social situations. But there's definitely opportunities to be as social as you want to be. And even the private dorm room that Eric had in college, he was on a suite. so he shared a suite with other students, and so there was always social opportunities. So even, you know, having a private dorm room does not mean that you're isolated in any way. So that's the best I can answer that with. I think there are probably some books and information out there that talk more about dating and social situations with autism and some of the challenges around that. But definitely you'd see a wide range of social interests in college students with ASD.
Okay. The next question was, where can I go to find a list of careers that seem to be appropriate for high-functioning individuals on the spectrum? Can you recommend any good reference books?
I know that Temple Grandin, as David mentioned earlier, has a book related to that, and so does Stephen Shore has a book related to self-advocating and career development. What I can do is look up some ideas and some resources, and maybe David can respond. I can send them to David and he can get those to you. The other suggestion I would have is to contact the Autism Society of North Carolina bookstore, and the staff that run the bookstore there are very knowledgeable about the books that are there, and they will have some ideas, I'm sure, about career development kind of ideas. I know there's numerous books written around that topic. So I'll look for some resources and get those to David, and he can share those with the person who asked the question.
And we also have been doing some work with some adults, and we're trying to grow a network of connecting adults with autism, whether they've gone to college or not, just so they have more of a social network. And what many of them have shared, those who are working, is that most of the times what's worked for them is something that they're interested in. And that's just anecdotal, but it has been a theme. And a few years ago, whenever Ann and I first met each other, we were both working at Teach, and I was working in supported employment. And I think one of the things that I found in working with folks and trying to find jobs that were a good fit that could turn into a career, it was important to figure out what it was that the person liked and was interested in, and what they enjoyed. And if you can match an interest to a job, then that does help with the success. And Ann, I think we've seen that with many different folks that we know that have kids that they've grown up and are now out working. It's just an aside, but I think it's important to mention that now. And somebody was asking if you're able to share where your son is working.
Sure. Eric's main interest in his life has always been animals, and he is working. When he graduated from college, I knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody working at the veterinary school at NC State who had hired somebody with a disability before, and I contacted that person and told them about Eric, and Eric went in for an interview, and he has been working at the NC State Veterinary School for 11 years now, I think. He's full-time state employee with full benefits. Hallelujah. And and I am thrilled and never want him to ever leave that job. But it's not the perfect job. It definitely isn't a job that would be considered for a college graduate. He washes animal cages most of the day, but they do let him have some time where he's doing animal care work, which he loves. And he's working with people who also love animals as he does, and I've found that they've been very accepting of him, and so we've been very fortunate in that he has a job related to his interests. Like David said, if you can find jobs related to things they enjoy. But I do believe that it really helps as you're looking at career choices. It helps who you know, unfortunately, in this world, finding where there might be some places that might be willing to hire people with autism through your network of support or whatever can be beneficial, because it's not always as easy to find the jobs. So use all the resources that you have to find them. But yes, we've been very fortunate. Thank you for asking how he's doing. And he lives in his own apartment, not too far from us, and is doing very well.
Shanya, if you'd like to chime in or to be able to wrap things up and give folks an idea of what's coming up next.
Yes, I just want to say thank you, Ann. I love this presentation. I've had an opportunity to hear it a couple of times, and her presentation has helped me as well as a mom with a child on the spectrum. If you all, we would like for you to return next month on August the 12th, same time, 7 p.m. Our topic for next month will be on puberty. So we would like for all of you to join us again next month as we continue having our online chapters.
And do you have any information about, on average, do kids on the spectrum finish their degree program in 4 years?
That's actually unusual, and I've found that it's unusual for most college students nowadays to finish in 4 years. It used to be that was the norm when I was in college, for sure. It was students tended to finish in 4 years. That is not the norm anymore for any students. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I know that typically it takes longer than 4 years for a college degree for any student, and it definitely tends to take longer than 4 years for a student on the autism spectrum, typically because they're maybe taking less of a load of classes each semester. And it's just harder the classes are tough, and it's harder to graduate with in 4 years when you have to take like 17 hours a semester to do that, and it's difficult to do that for any student. So I would expect that it will take longer for most of our kids with ASD in college.
Again, thank you so much, Ann. As Shanya said, we have another event coming up next month. Hope that everybody will join us then. This concludes the evening's webinar and online chapter meeting. So thank you so much for spending some time with us. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your Sunday evening. We look forward to your participation in a future online chapter meeting.